Avatar is real. Now, probably not the bit about the blue people. So for those of you who haven't seen the movie, James Cameron imagined this future world far, far away from us, where there were a community of people that lived within nature. Of course, along came human beings, and they wanted to extract the ore, which was called unobtainium, which should have been a clue. But anyway, I'm not going to ruin the rest of the movie for you. But what was interesting about this was this idea that there was communication happening between this alien race, the trees, and the microbes. So they lived with nature in a symbiotic relationship that was interconnected. They were capturing, how do you capture sunlight energy? There was zero waste, and then looking at how do we turn our constraints into opportunities. So this idea that James Cameron had of this future world is actually based on a lot of reality, and we've heard a lot of the speakers talk about these symbiotic relationships. So we're all pretty familiar with mycorrhizae at this point. So this idea that plants are sending down exudates out to those microbiology, and increasingly what they're seeing is those plants, that microbiology, is then supporting other trees around them. And what we're seeing now is that they're actually feeding the seedlings to allow seedlings to have a better start in life. You know, we're barely scratching on this knowledge of soil. So things like quorum sensing and what Dr. Singh was talking about, every time we discover something new about soil, we realize how little we really know. So I'm just going to go back in time a little bit to how it was that I ended up here tonight. So when I was 10 years old, my father was a pilot, and we had a small lifestyle block north of Auckland. He got a job with Cathay Pacific, and my world was turned upside down. So I left my horse and my goats and my cat, and we moved to one of the most, it was the most heavily, densely populated city in the world. It was certainly a culture shock, I must say. No, when I was 15, I was a really good competitive long-distance runner, and I was doing quite well at school. One day I came home from school, and I wasn't feeling very well. I had a fever, my neck had started to seize up, my muscles were getting really tight, and I broke out in a rash. So my parents took me to hospital, and they thought I had meningitis, so they gave me a lumbar puncture, which probably with a bit of hindsight was the worst thing they could have done. So they thought that I had meningitis. They dismissed me after about 2 days, gave me some antibiotics, so you've got some kind of virus. So it wasn't until 15 years later that I met a practitioner who said, no, in fact, what you have is paraquat poisoning. So I lived a life of, so those of you who don't know what paraquat is, it's a long-term residual herbicide. About a teaspoon will kill you. There's no antidote to paraquat. There's no way to get it actually out of your body. And luckily, I met someone who could find a way to get it out. So as a consequence of having this poisoning, I had headaches most days. I would have a migraine a couple of times a month. I lived in this really foggy space. So as a teenager, it was like you're just acting like a normal teenager. I was forgetful, and my neck seized up, so they thought I had fused vertebra in the spine. So when I met this guy, through a series of what involved hyperbaric chambers, intravenous vitamin C, I got my life back. So now I have full neck mobility. I wake up every morning and I'm just grateful that I don't have a headache. So what's the point of sharing this story with you? We really live in a world now that is utterly unrecognizable to that which our great-grandparents grew up in. You know, we've got antibiotics and hormones in our food supply. We've got electromagnetic pollution and climate change. We've got more chemicals or more names for chemicals than there are words in the English language. We now live in a world that instead of having us living in nature, we've warped nature to fit inside our worldview. And there's consequences to that. So we live in a modern paradigm which is about domination and control, to make things fit to our world or our way of being, that things need to be sterile, that we have waste being produced, that we're doing short-term thinking and just seeing the parts instead of the whole. So what I'd like you to do, just for a minute, if I can just invite you to engage with me, is be prepared to stand up. So, first of all, can I get you to stand up if either yourself or someone close to you has had a brush with cancer? Stand up. Thank you. Stay standing. Now, can I get you to stand up if someone close to you or yourself has been diagnosed with diabetes? Stand up. If someone you know or yourself has autoimmune disorders or allergies, stand up. Some of you have got all these things. Wow. And then if someone close to you or even yourself has been diagnosed with some kind of learning disorders, stand up. All right, now just keep standing. Stand up, stand up. I just want you to take a moment and look around the room. Okay? So what we're seeing is an unintended consequence of what's happening in the world right now. Thank you, sit down. What we're seeing now is every year, autoimmune disorders such as MS, Crohn's disease, diabetes are on the rise from about 19 to 20% per year on an increase. Okay? People talk about we need to feed the world. 1 in 9 people is starving. Well, 2 out of 5 are overweight or obese. The most dangerous thing now is not wars or famines or plagues. The most dangerous thing on the planet is a can of Coke, yeah, and unprocessed foods, right? So this is the world that we've created. And part of it is that I don't know if it's human nature or part of the modern dilemma, but we live with this paradigm of if we have a problem, we've got to run around and look for what the solution might be. And then what often happens as a consequence of this is that solution then ends up causing us more problems. So one example of this, is quite like this example, is in the 18th century, the beginning of the industrial era, people started flocking to the cities, attracted by the bright lights and moving out of the rural community and into the cities. Now, as a consequence, one thing that started to happen, it became increasingly difficult to get good quality food or fresh food, and nearly impossible to get milk because milk soured. So it was before there was times of refrigeration, obviously. So some geniuses in New York thought, this is a great business opportunity because one thing we have in the city are whiskey distilleries, right? And they're making all of this waste and sludge. Well, we can take that sludge and we can feed it to the cows. It would be brilliant. So they brought the cows into the city. So they could put them in the huge big confinement areas and fed them the whiskey sludge. Brilliant, all right, now we've got this raw milk product that we can provide to the city, great booming business, but as a consequence of these cows being inside in these confined conditions, on average they live for about a year. And I hate to imagine how much pus those people were drinking, yeah? So there was all this mastitis and actual disease in the actual milk, so that when people were drinking it or feeding it to their babies, at the same time, infant mortality went from 32% to 50%. Yep, so that's part of this. If we've got a problem, we're going to find some kind of solution. Fortunately, Louis Pasteur came along. We learned about pasteurization. We could heat treat it. Problem solved. Except now we've killed the enzyme that we need to actually break down milk, so we've got more and more people with milk allergies. And what's really interesting is in Australia, you guys have like this weird phobia about raw milk. What's going on? So in New Zealand, one of my best friends has the largest raw milk dairy in the country. They're supplying dairy products all over New Zealand. They actually legally are now allowed to sell raw milk. When the health inspectors try and shut them down, which helps on a regular basis, they've actually tested their milk and shown that if you drop some salmonella or campylobacter into their raw milk, the beneficial microbiology get hold of it and gobble it up. And then you have 0 pathogens in that milk because they have nutrition in that system. So how I look at regenerative agriculture is, instead of spending some time trying to fix problems, and surely we do some of that, we actually look at what is the structural issue beneath this problem. So asking these why questions, why do I have weeds, pests, and disease? And actually really looking at going to work and addressing them. So one of my favourite clients that I work with in New Zealand, they're the largest nursery in the country. They're called Riversun Nurseries. They do between 3.5 to 5 million rootstock per year for the viticulture, kiwi fruit, and avocado industry. They're an incredibly exciting team to work with. They have 3 PhD scientists working in their team. They have a 1,000-year sustainability vision. Imagine. So really exciting. So what we do is we look at everything that's confronting the business and go, will this be sustainable in 1,000 years? And why are we currently using it? So asking that question, why? So one example of this is the use of black plastic. So they have a huge amount of plastic waste that they're producing every year. And they put the black plastic down, they cover the mounds, as you can see here. And what happens is it's great because it warms the soil up very quickly in spring. So they get better root growth and warmer soils. Fantastic. What happens later on in the season, it gets so hot that they've got to go out and paint them white. We're talking about a huge enterprise here, so they're out there painting it all white. Now, also as a consequence of having the black plastic there, you need to irrigate it. So they've got plastic tape underneath, which is also causing waste. So we looked at why is it that they were using this particular product. And when we got to the bottom, basically for weed suppression. So 3 years ago, they trialed rolling barley straw down the middle of these rows. And it worked fantastically well. So we got water retention, it was feeding microbiology, no longer required the irrigation tapes, didn't have all the plastic. It was awesome. Unfortunately, they ended up with a whole lot of barley sprouting. So they ended up with more weeds than maybe they would have done otherwise. But instead of kicking the baby out with the bathwater, they looked at actually sterilizing, so heat treating those barley bales, and so then the following year, rolled it down the rows. Now you'd think something like that would be too expensive or labor intensive. It saved them significant labor hours and significant money. So it's by asking those why questions that we actually look at how do we solve these kind of dilemmas. And it's not about solving things. It's about dissolving the structural issues so that those problems aren't even a concern. And there's been so many people in the last couple of days who've talked about that. Weeds, pests and disease, what are you talking about? We don't get those kind of things. We don't need to apply pesticides. We're not having to chase our tails, basically. So I was really excited when Fiona asked me to present a presentation on what the future would look like. And I started thinking about, well, wouldn't it be great if we valued ecosystem services, or we actually had some kind of payment scheme to look at the whole cost of manufacturing? Or instead of a GDP, we had like a happiness measure. And the more and more I started to run with it, the more it kind of came to me as an epiphany that I really can't predict what the future could look like, and I don't think any of us can. And in fact, when we do try and predict what the future will look like, we bring with us our past. So there's lots of really good examples of this. Like, you probably heard some of these quotes like, "The horse is here to stay. The automobile is just a fad." So that was the advisor to Henry Ford before the whole Ford revolution. Or the chairman of IBM saying in 1945, "I think there's a global need for maybe 5 computers in the future." Or from the gentleman who invented the machine gun, "After this, war will be impossible." Yep, we're so limited by this boundary that we sit in, or these paradigms that we sit in. So what I'm really interested in is behavior change. So what is it that enables a producer to go from one way of farming to another way of farming? What is it that really gets them connected? And so the second part of my story about the paraquat was that I didn't know that I'd been poisoned. So for my entire young adult life, I've spent committed to how do we help people reduce their chemical loads, how do we produce nutrient-dense foods and clean up waterways. But I did this without this knowing or knowledge that I'd been poisoned. But yet somehow intuitively or subconsciously, I had carried it with me. And I think it's the same for so many of us. We have this sense that something's not quite right. And so it's how do we connect that intellect, our intellect with our intuition? Because we're surely some very smart people. And I think probably in this room with all of us collectively, we could solve all the world's problems. Yeah? We don't need more and more intellect. We're very, very smart people. It's kind of smartness that got us into these situations. And I know in farming communities, it's kind of hard to talk sometimes about those things that we care about. What do you really love? You know, what makes your heart sing? Why is it that you're farming to begin with? Because a lot of the time it's not finances, and it's probably not finances for lots of people, but we make choices not based on graphs or data or, yep, this is the best, most financially sound thing. We do things because we really care about it. So we do things because we're doing it for our families, or we want to leave the land in better shape. But often there's a gap between what we're really committed to and how we're going to get there. And so that's kind of what my message is about. Globally, people have never had as much power at any time that we do today. you look at the internet, you can see there's this awakening and this awareness around food quality and food safety. I was recently at the McDonald's pilot program for sustainable beef. Right. And what they were saying was, this is the biggest questions that McDonald's get asked is, how is our meat growing? Are they happy cows? How do they live? Can we see the pictures? People want to know, how is their food growing? And so it's not necessarily about having more leaders to drive the charge, but actually that individually and collectively we can come together. And if we look at kind of the rules of nature or how nature plays things out, because I think that's a big part of the problem, is that we think we're separate, or that it's something over there that we can chase, when actually it's here with us. So it's not a lack of intellect. It's rather, who do you need to be in order for that world to come about? Like if you can imagine Australia or the whole planet as a regenerative nation, what's it going to require in ourselves in order to be that?